welcome to the Festival of Ideas. My name is Lydia Zelderist. I am from the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York, and I have the honor of being the chair for today's talk. And I am very pleased to welcome you and to welcome you in person. How exciting that this is possible again. I see some people cheering. Yes, indeed. Now, before I introduce you to our wonderful speaker, I have to talk about the practical stuff, of course, because that's what one has to do in these kinds of situations. You will have seen this slide here behind and way above me. This is the health and safety notice, and it also tells you what to do in the case of an evacuation. It's an evacuation slide. Obviously, I'm supposed to say, in the very unlikely event of an emergency, and I do hope it is very unlikely, would you please be so kind as to follow the stewards who will give you the directions to your nearest exit, and there are lots of exits around, so we should be all right. And please, can I also ask you, sorry, people started laughing. Did that make it sound ominous? We really will be all right. Please, can I also ask you to put your phones on silent? I know that we're not used to that anymore with these in-person things. At home you can receive a call, but here, of course, it would be slightly faux pas, as it were. So just as a reminder, whether you would want to do that. I see people scrambling, so we should be all right. So I shall introduce our wonderful speaker, who is seated over here. Katherine Harvey is a historian, a writer, and a reviewer, and she specializes in medieval history. She is an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck, University of London, and she teaches for both Birkbeck and the Open University. Katherine has also published widely on medieval topics, including sexuality, gender, emotion, and the body, which I think bodes well for our lusty topic of today. We are very delighted that she is joining us today. She's going to talk about her latest book, which is The Fires of Lust, Sex in the Middle Ages. You almost can't get a better title than that, I think. It explores it gives us a fascinating insight into the sex lives of ordinary medieval people. And how ordinary were they? We will find out, I think. But she kind of reveals the challenges and the experiences that they faced, which perhaps might in some ways be quite similar to challenges and experiences that we face today. We will find out. I should say that should the talk also spark your fires, let me not say of lust, because that's a bit wrong, but should it spark your fires in more interest, the book is also available here if you wanted to peruse it, and if you haven't read it yet, you can have a look after the talk. But I will stop chatting now because you're not here for me, you're here for Katherine. So without further ado, I will let Katherine take the floor and dazzle us with her wonderful talk.
Thank you, and thank you for so many of you for being here. So it's lovely to be back in person and to see so many of you tonight to be here. So, yes, medieval sex. I'm never going to live this one down. When I first started working on this book and I started telling people that I was writing about medieval sex, apart from going, you're doing what, I very quickly found that there were three things that people thought about this subject. The first was that we didn't know anything about it. I couldn't possibly write a book about sex in the Middle Ages because we couldn't find anything out about it. But then that there were sort of preconceptions about what people thought it would be like. And one was what I came to think of as the Game of Thrones model. It was all very violent, it was rapey, it was incestuous, it was all really nasty. Then there was the sort of the Mills and Boon version, that it was all forceful knights and swooning ladies. That was another possibility. And then there was people who'd watched too much Carry On and thought that it was all chastity belts and sort of sexual repression, but also sex mad and all quite funny. I think what all of those ideas have in common is that they see medieval sexuality as very different from its modern equivalent. But I suppose people also think, well, it can't have changed that much because we've all got bodies, they're all the same, they can all do the same things, so it must have stayed the same. So what did I find when I started writing about this? Well, some of those things are true, but that there have been really quite significant changes in how sex has been regarded, and so how it's understood, how it's experienced, One of the big things I think that surprises people is that medieval people tended to see sex as something that one person did to another, rather than as something that both people are actively engaged in. So they really tend to see it in terms of active, by which I mean male roles, or they meant male roles, and passive, by which they meant female roles. And even when they're talking about same-sex sex, they force people into that active and passive mould. I also found that certain acts had changed in their significance. So, for example, something like kissing, that for us, kissing on the lips, I think, tends to be seen as sexual to the point that some people are uncomfortable even with the idea of you kiss your own children on the lips. In the Middle Ages, they could be erotic, but they could also be about respect, about political bonds. One of the big things in the Becket dispute was about Henry II wouldn't give Becket the kiss of peace, and that wasn't because they were in love, that was because that was what you did to show that you respected somebody. Language has changed so that terms that we now use that are fundamental to our understanding, heterosexuality, homosexuality, those words didn't exist in the Middle Ages. They're mostly 19th century inventions, and I don't think they help very much in understanding medieval sex, so I tend not to use them very much. Historians have suggested that maybe we ought to think about medieval sex in terms of acts rather than identities, or maybe to use different categories. So we might think about natural versus unnatural, or illicit versus illicit, or virginity versus pretty much everything else. So those are some of the ideas behind this that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about medieval sex. And I suppose I was also really keen when I was writing this book to bear in mind that just as we don't all think the same, we don't all do the same. That was true in the Middle Ages. The book covers several centuries, whole of Europe. Not everybody thought the same. Having said that, of course, individual attitudes and behaviours are shaped by the world in which we live, by legal constraints, by medical ideas, and in many societies, and particularly in medieval Europe, by religious beliefs. And so the first thing I want to talk to you about tonight is about some of the ideas behind which influence the sex lives of medieval people. So this rather lovely little set of medieval wall paintings, this is down in a church in Sussex, and they show the story of Adam and Eve. And this familiar Bible story really matters in the Middle Ages because it's at the heart of medieval understandings of sex. Before the fall, they thought that Adam and Eve were sort of humans as they were supposed to be. So they were immortal, they were free from sin, they had perfect bodies. Medieval theologians spent a surprising amount of time debating what sex would have been like in the Garden of Eden. They spent a lot of time thinking about that. What they all agreed on was that it would have been free from sin. And that it would have been something that happened for good reasons, so for reproduction, rather than bad reasons, lust. After the fall, of course, everything changes. It becomes a disruptive force, a source of shame. Everyone's conceived through sex is tainted by original sin. And so sex really becomes a source of fear for a lot of medieval Christians. As one 12th century English sermon put it, bodily pleasure is but for a moment, but the hellfire which follows thereon will endure forever. So the surest way to avoid this hellfire is to copy the saints, to remain a virgin. And that's really difficult for a mere mortal to achieve because medieval ideas about virginity, it's not just a physical state, it's a mental one too. So think impure thoughts, you're not a virgin. Masturbate, you're definitely not a virgin. So it's really quite limited. On the other hand, the positive was that because it was a mental state, you could actually regain your virginity, in a sense, even if you'd had sex, which was a comfort to quite a lot of particularly medieval women. People like Marjorie Kemp, who had, I think, 15 children, then had a chaste marriage. And then Jesus reassured her that she'd still be a virgin. She'd dance with the virgins in heaven, was how he put it, in one of their regular conversations. We shouldn't get too carried away, on the other hand, by the idea that medieval church was completely opposed to sex, because most people did marry. By the Middle Ages, the church accepted that that was probably a good thing, not least because it saved the souls of people who didn't have it in them to be abstinent, but of course it produces Christian children, and if Christianity is going to go on existing, you need Christian offspring. And they were also, of course, there were a lot of high ideals in medieval Christianity, but they were also quite keen on the idea of forgiveness. And so if you repent, you're genuinely contrite, you can emulate Mary Magdalene, who was one of the most popular late medieval saints, repentant prostitute, turned into a follower of Christ, ends up as a saint. You too can do that. At least that's the hope. So that's the religious ideas. Then there's the medicine. Medieval medicine was really different to today's. But I think it's a lot more coherent and sort of logical than people tend to assume. The key principle, of course, is the idea of the four humours, that there are these four fluids in the body, that they need to be kept in balance, and that if they become unbalanced, you'll get sick. And within that system, sex is a form of excretion. So it's a good thing, in moderation. If you have too much, on the other hand, men who have too much sex lose heat from their bodies, moisture from their bodies. That can make them seriously ill, even die. They can even die of it. Women were less at risk because they were naturally cold and they're warmed up by sex, which is good. But because both sexes were thought to release seed during intercourse, to be abstinent can be bad for both of you. And so both men and women can die of celibacy. Balance is really the key thing. You mustn't have too much, you mustn't have too little. But, I mean, they were aware that there was such a thing as sexually transmitted disease. As this chap has found out. They were particularly worried about catching leprosy like this, particularly going to prostitutes, catching leprosy. There's an early 14th century story about a man called Arnaud of Verneuil, he was a student in Toulouse. He went to see a prostitute. The next day, his face swelled up, and he was terrified. He thought he caught leprosy off of the woman. He swore never to have sex with a woman again. He started having sex with men and ends up in the church courts for that, so I don't think it solved all his problems, but And I think when we hear stories like that, we often assume they're about superstition and that these people thought that God was punishing them. And I think sometimes that's the case, but they do make sense in terms of medieval medical theory. So medical texts explain how if a leper has sex with a prostitute, his semen will then stay in her womb, it will be chilled, and then it will then enter through the pores of the next man, a man who has sex with her. So there is a sort of real medical theory behind that. Similarly, with all the concerns about sex and plague, again, there is a concern about sin, because obviously the middle of an epidemic when you might die is the last time when you want to annoy God. But there is, again, concern about what's going to enter through your pores, that sex warms you up, it opens your pores, all sorts of bad things will come into your body. Better not. And these texts, they also include cures for people like this poor chap, but unfortunately they're not very nice either. So some of them are quite tame, things like you have sex, you wash your penis with vinegar after. Then there are some like you anoint it with quicklime. And I think when you read something like that, you think, well, maybe virginity wasn't such a bad idea after all. The third principle, I suppose, governing medieval sex is the idea that the authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical, need to control people's sexual behaviour. And that's both because it's important on an individual level that you make sinners repent so they can be saved, but also because there was this sort of idea that one bad apple would contaminate the whole community, and then God might well punish you. And so that is a problem. And so, as we shall see this evening, there were lots of rules governing the sex lives of medieval people, and potentially serious consequences for people who broke those rules. So, anyway, that's the theory. What about real life? Well, the first thing you need to do if you want to have sex is to find a partner. And in the Middle Ages, just as today, that could be quite a difficult thing to do. As personal preference comes into it, but so do various social constraints. So, to begin with, obviously, according to medieval rules, your partner needs to be of the opposite sex. That's key. It's also important that you're not related, and this is a chart that explains all the people you can't marry. Their idea of incest was much broader than ours. So you couldn't marry anybody out to your third cousin. A third cousin or closer is banned, but also the relatives of anybody you've ever had sex with, and anybody related to you by godparentage. So, your godmother's family are out too. You wonder how many people were actually left in a small medieval village once you'd taken out all of those people. But anyway, that's one consideration. Age, despite the idea there were lots of child marriages in the Middle Ages, they're actually pretty rare. They frown on that. Canon law said a girl had to be at least 12 and a boy at least 14. And so again, the medical theory suggested that although teenagers were naturally lustful, sex was bad for them. They'd produce disabled offspring, it would drain their own sort of vital strength, and so according to the doctors, you shouldn't be having sex until you were at least 20. There are all sorts of other things. You're supposed to be sort of compatible in the sense that you're of the same religion, roughly the same social status, roughly the same age. They don't like big age gaps. They don't like very rich people marrying very poor people. Parental consent obviously does matter. It does matter that your family approves, but so is the consent of the couple. They're very big on the idea that the couple must consent to a marriage. And love and attraction clearly do play a part in lots of medieval marriages. So, what did people find attractive? Well, this is Bathsheba, who seems to have been the late medieval ideal woman. And as you can see, she's blonde-haired, she's pale-skinned, she's very slim, fine features, tiny little breasts. Big breasts are associated with promiscuity. You don't want big breasts in the Middle Ages. Men were supposed to be tall, well-proportioned. Body hair was often seen as a symbol of masculinity, so was seen as attractive. And it was widely assumed, at least by male writers, that women liked men with big penises. Although people weren't supposed to have sex before marriage, but some people inevitably did. And the broad sense is that probably as long as you had sex with your fiancé, you got married, certainly before any babies turned up, you'd probably get away with it. Having said that, there were risks. I mean, premarital sex could be punished as fornication. It did damage reputations. You do get cases where women go, after they'd had sex with a man, they couldn't find anybody to marry them. And the informality of the marriage-making process was quite a big problem. Although the church was very keen on the fact that you have to religious ceremony in church, actually you can just sort of exchange sort of informal vows and then have sex, and then you're married, and you can see what sort of awful problems that could cause. A lot of people end up in court for breach of promise, or in the case of some women, suing for child support. There were, though, problems with not having sex before marriage. One potential danger was that somebody might use love magic on you, which is a real concern in the Middle Ages. Some of this is sort of food and drink trickery, mainly associated with women, so things like putting menstrual blood in drinks, or there's one that comes up in a penitential text about feeding your husband bread that you've made by kneading it on your buttocks. That feels to me like something that a man who'd never made bread came up with. I'm not even convinced that's physically possible, but there we go. Yeah. Educated men tend to get accused of nastier sort of magic demons, conjuring up magic circles into which they can summon women who they can then force to have sex, and that's all much nastier, whereas the folk stuff is more bizarre. But both are really problematic to medieval people, actually, because they make people have sex with people they wouldn't want to without the love magic. And they're actually, it's not just about being icky, it's about consent, which is far more important to medieval people than we tend to assume. Love sickness is another risk. That's a real disease in the Middle Ages. Mainly tends to afflict very wealthy young men, who you suspect maybe have got nothing better to do than to moon after a woman. But it is seen as a serious medical disease. So, anyway, that's courtship. You finally find yourself a partner, and then what happens? Well, sex is a very important part of medieval marriage. And the church is that, not just because you want offspring. A lot of people thought that a marriage was only truly a marriage once it had been consummated, and couples were told they owed each other what was called the marital debt. That is, you've got a religious obligation to have sex with your spouse. By the 12th century, that was taken so seriously that there were only a handful of times in which, according to the church, you could refuse. Things like, if the demand was mad, you can say no then. If you're heavily pregnant and it might cause a stillbirth, that's seen as a justification. But generally, rules on which the early medieval church had taken a really firm line, things like you mustn't have sex during Lent, you mustn't have sex in church, they were now allowed to be overlooked in certain circumstances. If the only place you could have sex was church, well, go on then, now becomes the line. Because it's seen as it's better to, say, have sex on Good Friday than to force your husband to commit adultery by refusing. Yeah. Yeah, I argue the Middle Ages is sensible, and then they do something like that, and I give up. But yeah, what this doesn't mean is that couples are supposed to be having really enthusiastic sex all the time. In fact, in some ways, I think it turns it into a sort of a duty rather than a pleasure. They fret about the idea that taking too much pleasure in one's wife is a sin. If you'd want to have sex with her, even if you weren't married with her, that's bad. And of course, I think there were pretty quite serious implications for women in terms of there's no marriage equals consent, there's no such thing as marital rape. You can see where the balance of power is probably going to fall there in the wrong marriage. Despite the importance of marital sex, there was such a thing as chaste marriage, a union in which a couple gave up sex for religious reasons. And so, yeah, that's a possibility that people don't tend to take formal vows of that because you get into all sorts of trouble then if you go back on that. But you do get people who take formal vows, they agree. And again, that can cause all sorts of problems. Marjorie Kemp, again, is a famous example of that. And, of course, then, while some couples get married, they agree to give up sex, others get married and then find they can't. And that's another set of problems. You can get an annulment on grounds of non-consummation, typically only because of male impotence. It seems to have been assumed that the best way to deal with a woman who said she couldn't have sex was to force her. But you do get cases on grounds of male impotence. They're very rare. I mean, in the whole of the Archdiocese of York, which is quite a big archdiocese, we know of, I think it's 4 cases on grounds of sexual incompatibility for the whole of the 14th and 15th centuries. So it is very, very rare, but it can happen. The level of proof required is really high. They worry quite a lot about couples colluding just because they want to split up. They'll claim that they can't have sex. And so it's a long, a difficult process. They often make people wait for several years before they can split up. And it often involves intimate physical examinations of both men and women. So here in York, in the early 1430s, there's a case of a man named William Barton, who was examined by no fewer than 13 people when they tried to get their marriage annulled. Women who compared his genitals favourably to their husbands, men who judged his erect penis in comparison to theirs. His wife was also examined by women who had a look at her breasts and judged that her breasts were not those of a virgin. She wouldn't let them examine her genitals, which they thought meant it was deeply suspicious. She must be hiding something. I mean, in a way, this sounds quite funny, but I think when you think about the idea of your neighbours having a good look at your genitals to see whether you should be allowed to split up with your husband, in this case, the husband was judged to have proved his potency, and they had to stay together. And I can't help wondering about the state of their marriage after that. It doesn't feel like it would have done much for it. There we go. But of course, another really important factor in a lot of marriages would have been, do you have children? And if a couple want to have children, medical authorities have got plenty of advice on that too. They've got advice for everything. But what is surprising, I think, to us is how much of it's about sexual pleasure. Because the dominant medical theory about conception suggested that both men and women needed to produce seed to conceive, so both parties need to have an orgasm. And so there's a surprising amount in medieval medical texts about foreplay, about sexual positions, on what to do afterwards, basically keep still. There are lots of tips on how to conceive a male or a female, and when you shouldn't have sex. One of my favourite cautionary tales is about a woman who had sex in a storm, and so she gave birth to a toad. Word of warning there. Yeah. Infertility also gets discussed a lot, and despite what the story of Henry VIII and his wives would seem to suggest, there actually does seem to have been quite a lot of awareness of the fact that the fault could lie with the woman or the man, or with the combination of the two. So there are lots of urine-based tests to show whether you're fertile or not. Lots of possible explanations for physical defects, divine displeasure, humoral imbalances. There are lots of possible treatments. There's a wonderful set of 14th century letters between a merchant couple from Prato in Italy called Margherita and Francesco Datti. And they tried for years to have children, and they never did. But their family and friends had lots of helpful solutions. They suggested she should go to a doctor who cured another woman with similarly painful periods. Somebody suggested a really stinky poultice. Somebody thought they needed to move. Somebody said feed more beggars. All of these silly women's remedies won't make any good. They were, I suppose, at least lucky in the sense that they were surrounded by people who were trying to help them. You do also get rather sad stories in court records of women who fraudsters stole them special sheets or medals or something that are supposed to help them conceive, and then they disappear with the money, and of course the baby never materialises. And then while you've got some medieval people desperately trying to conceive, others of course don't want to. So what methods were available to couples who didn't want children? A lot of the techniques based on what we've seen about how you conceive and mixing of seeds, a lot of them are aimed to stop that. So coitus interruptus, putting oil on the genitals to make them slippery so the seeds won't stick, jumping up and down or sneezing after sex. Some people seem to think that was quite common. There's a cleric writing in early 14th century Yorkshire who claimed that coitus interruptus was widely practiced and that many people these days don't think it's a sin. So it does seem to be something that did happen. There are other options like you eat rhubarb to suppress lust, you anoint the genitals with mint, you chop off the testicles of a male weasel and stick them around your neck. They're all based on humoral theory. They do all make sense in terms of that, to be fair. So they're not as random as they sound, but don't try them. Abortion is even harder to trace, partly because it was widely viewed as murder, so it's something that you desperately try to cover up. But there are definitely cases that I've come across where women took special portions, or they drink hard liquor, or they're punched in the stomach, or they go to a doctor claiming that they're suffering from bad constipation or something, so they'll get a strong purgative that they hope will cause a miscarriage. It does seem that we can be fairly sure that the knowledge and means to terminate pregnancy were circulating, even if the efficacy of those methods might be doubtful. So far I've very much focused on normal medieval lifestyles, I suppose, courtship, marriage, children. And of course, not everybody, even the Middle Ages, went through that or even wanted to. And one really big group who weren't supposed to were the clergy, who from the late 11th century onwards are supposed to be celibate. Something quite a lot of them struggled with. Some received miraculous interventions. There's a great story about a German nun who was going off to meet her lover when a statue of the Virgin Mary slapped her in the face. And so she spent the night out cold in the church rather than out with her boyfriend. Others, followed the example of this chap and castrated themselves. The church didn't think that was a good idea. More prosaically, they tended to do things like keep out the way of the opposite sex. Some really devout priests and nuns took it to the extent they wouldn't even look at their own relatives of the opposite sex. And they adopt lifestyles that are supposed, again, in medical terms, to suppress lust. So down the road at Rievaulx in the 12th century, Abbot Elred had a special chamber built for him into which there's a cold stream flows into it so he could immerse himself in that. That was supposed to suppress lust. And that's quite a sensible strategy compared to Goderic of Finkel, a hermit around the same time, he often went skinny dipping in the River Tees. But he also lives on stale bread, he chopped wood wearing a chainmail coat, and he liked to chuck himself in the brambles. And they were all things that were supposed to suppress lust. The sorts of things that medieval clerics get up to, you think they probably would have been better just getting a wife. But, yeah. And of course, a lot of them just fail completely. One study from around the turn of the 16th century has estimated that somewhere between 45 and 60% of the clergy in Brabant around 1500 were presented for sexual offences at some point in their career. And there are quite some variations across Europe. So in Iberia, they don't seem terribly bothered about clerical sex until about the 15th century. They're far more concerned about mixed faith relationships. And so you get stories about monks forming long-term relationships. There's one rather sweet story about a couple in a monastery in Spain who the prior has got a partner who he won't get rid of. The monks say they spend most of their time reading together in the kitchen. And I suppose what that illustrates is how much, when these people were struggling with sexual temptation, it wasn't just about sex, it was about that whole lifestyle, it was about what else you didn't get if you joined the clergy and what they missed out on. That's quite a nice story. Then there are sort of the things that were going on at Dorchester Abbey near Oxford in the mid-15th century, where the abbot had 5 mistresses and another monk had been caught with a woman in the bell tower and hidden her chest. And another monk had to pay off several husbands when he got his mistresses pregnant. And one of them spent all his time shut in his chamber playing chess with the women. So, obviously that was a really bad example, but I think you can see that there were quite a range of approaches to clerical celibacy going on. Of course, the clergy weren't the only people subject to strict rules. Anybody could end up in court for fornication or adultery or incest or even bestiality. They're all in there. Under some legal systems, they are capital crimes. Mostly they're not. In reality, very few people get executed in the Middle Ages for these sorts of offences. Far more get some sort of form of corporal punishment. There's quite a lot of flogging going on, quite a lot of processing to church in your shifts to humiliate you. And in the south of France and Spain, in the 13th and 14th centuries, they come up with this. This is running. and they tie you together at the level of your genitals, make you process through the streets naked, tied to your lover. And you're so humiliated, you're not going to do this again, and none of your neighbours want to either, is the idea. What it isn't supposed to do, though, is it's not supposed to ostracise people from their communities. Obviously you are punishing people, but they, particularly for adultery, they get increasingly keen on the idea you must do this in a way that the marriage can be put back together. It's definitely not, in most places, grounds for murdering a wife or sending her off to a convent or any of the things that often happen in films and books about the Middle Ages. And in fact, some people are really surprisingly sympathetic to female adultery. There are theologians who argue that actually, well, men are supposed to have more control and set an example. Women, well, they will do that sort of thing. There is even a famous French theologian, Jacques de Vitry, who claimed that much female adultery resulted from sadness and desperation provoked by male bad behaviour, which I think is probably quite, more sympathetic than we expect. That sort of open-mindedness, it surprises us, but there were lots and lots and lots of ways to get it wrong. One of the most serious sexual offences in the Middle Ages was sodomy. And that's a really broad term, much broader than we tend to think of it being now. So it encompasses basically anything non-normative, anything that involves the sort of anything non-reproductive, sex in the wrong position, the wrong orifice, with somebody of the same sex, masturbation, basically anything other than sex between a man and woman in the missionary position for the sake of reproduction is a sin, although nobody's told him. I suppose what we might then reasonably ask is, how far did people listen? It's very, very hard to find out what went on in an ordinary medieval bedroom. But I think it is clear that people do know about the sort of sex that was not sanctioned by the church. There are, for example, some jokey stories, quite a lot of jokey stories about naive men who have sex with a more experienced woman and then become convinced that they must be pregnant because she went on top. Some practices do seem to have been viewed as repugnant by the population as a whole, rather than just by the church. I've come across several cases of marriages which ended because the wife refused to have anal sex with her husband. There were very, very few references to oral sex, to the extent that I think it's probably fair to assume it was rarely practiced. There are surprisingly frequent references, though, to interfemoral intercourse, which seems to have been used as a form of contraception, and also crops up quite often in cases of men who had sex with other men. And sometimes they explicitly say they do that because they think it's a lesser sin than anal sex, which is quite interesting. One which also conveniently brings us to the question of same-sex sex. I think, unsurprisingly, attitudes were pretty much consistently hostile throughout our period, but the intensity of that hostility and the impact varied by time and over region. One place I look at in particular detail is in Florence, which by the 15th century was so strongly associated with sodomy of this kind that in Germany, men who had sex with men were nicknamed Florencers. The Florentine authorities definitely thought they had a problem. In the second half of the 14th century, they started to impose harsher penalties. By the 1430s, they'd set up something called the Office of the Knight, which was just dedicated to punishing men who had sex with other men. And they prosecuted thousands of men over the next 70 years before that was shut down. And the records of that institution are great because they tell us about the ways in which offences were prosecuted and punished, but they also tell us about real men who were living and having relationships in Florence. And so we've got a lot of casual sex in semi-public places, lots of doorways, stables. Particular parts of the city seem to have become very strongly associated with places to meet men. We get this thing that I was talking about earlier about the active and passive roles coming up. A lot of these cases are an active adult with a passive adolescent. So a lot of them do feel rather uncomfortable by our standards, actually, and they might explain why some preachers in particular were obsessed with the idea of the corruption of youth in this way. But although there's a lot of casual sex and brief liaisons in those courts, we do also get long-term relationships. There's a chap called Michele and Carlo who were accused in 1497, and their records, they tell us they've been in a committed relationship for several years. One of them said he'd been seized by love for the other. He kept him like his wife. They'd exchanged an oath on the Gospels to remain faithful to each other, so that we can start to build up a picture of real people. What about women who had sex with women? They are virtually impossible to trace. For the whole of the Middle Ages, we know of, I think it's about 24 cases of women who were punished for having sex with other women. And most of them do get executed, actually. In the cases we do know about, again, there's this really strong tendency to see it in terms of active and passive roles, and the one who takes the active, the male role, is seen as having committed a more serious offence, is far more likely to be executed. And so there's an early 15th century French case where there's a relationship between two women called Joan and Laurence, two married women. They both get prosecuted, they both get imprisoned. But Laurence appeals and says that the other woman, she's initiated the relationship, she climbed on her as a man does a woman, and then attacked her with a knife when she tried to end the relationship. So by presenting herself as the woman in the relationship, Laurence got a much shorter sentence. And of course, I suspect that sort of attitude may have actually helped some women to go unnoticed, because if you're not aggressively sort of behaving in a masculine way, people don't look for it. And so we can try as historians to look at sort of other sources. Where might we find other evidence for same-sex attraction? And one interesting possibility is tomb markers. This one's in Istanbul. This is from two English knights who died in the 1390s within a few days of each other. And the Westminster Abbey Chronicle records their death and says that the one who died first, the other one pined away a few days later. He wouldn't eat, he died. This is a brass of two women from a little church down on the Kent-Sussex border. Agnes died nearly 30 years after Elizabeth. She's not married, and she chooses to be buried with her friend Elizabeth in the church there. And some people have argued that, well, are these a couple? Both of these cases, they're presented looking to each other like a couple. It's very unusual to see that sort of memorial for people who aren't a couple. Are they firm evidence for same-sex relationships? No. We could be looking at spiritual brotherhood, we could be looking at close friendships, but I think it's at least worth questioning the evidence, seeing what we're seeing. So, yeah, lots of ways to defy sexual norms. Another way is to do with race and religion. There are lots of racial stereotypes. Here's one of them. But the tendency is to other people by accusing them of indulging in deviant sexual practices, having, shall we say, unusual physical characteristics. There's a chap in the 12th century called Gerald of Wales who writes a lot about different foreigners. He said, well, the Irish, they were a filthy people who wallowed in vice and committed incest with everybody. Dutch women were supposedly famous for their abundant pubic hair. English women for their large breasts. There's even more stereotyping, obviously, of non-white, non-European people. There's a lot of crusading literature about Muslims getting up to sort of all sorts of terrible sexual sins. Interestingly, Muslim sources tend to describe Christians in similar terms, so it goes both ways. And yeah, stories like Mandeville's Travels, I mean, they are full of stories of wife swapping and naked bathing and hermaphrodites, and you name it, it's in there. And I think it probably tells us something both quite interesting about the way foreigners were perceived, but also about what people find interesting, shall we say, in the Middle Ages. I mean, all sorts of groups get stereotyped. There's a lot of stuff in the book about Jewish sexuality. Interfaith relationships they were very concerned about. And it does seem to be faith, not race, is the problem, the mixing of faiths. Heretics get accused of all sorts of sexual deviancy. I don't think you're a real heretic in the Middle Ages unless you're accused of participating in an orgy in a cave. Women accused of having sex with demons, yeah, all sorts. Selling sex, of course, was another good way to defy sexual norms. Again, there's quite a range of attitudes from sort of hostility, chuck them all out, to sympathy, help them, and everything between. The church obviously views prostitutes as sinners, is convinced they can try their best to try and reform them. The authorities more wrestle with something we're still wrestling with today. Do you legalise or do you try and ban? Up until the 13th century, the emphasis was very much on banning it. Chuck them out of the city, get rid of them. Then towns and cities in most of Europe start to think, well, maybe we're better to legalise this, to form city brothels, certain sort of authorised red light districts, and then you can regulate it, you can control it, you can try and limit the social nuisance, you can try and tackle the violence against these women. They also try to regulate who could go, so it's sort of seen as, well, if you're a young single man who, in medical terms, needs to have sex, well, okay, you can go to the brothel. If you're a husband or a cleric, you shouldn't. Inevitably, that didn't really work. And in fact, cities with large clerical populations tend to become big centres of prostitution. York was one. There were women in 15th century York who seem to have specialised in catering to clerics and keep getting presented for prostitution with clerics. Inevitably, what went on, even in these licensed brothels, was often pretty grim. There's a lot of trafficking going on, a lot of violent attacks by clients. There are stories about women forced to have abortions. And the city authorities often do try and regulate that, but it's hard, it doesn't always work. And so, yeah, that's all a bit grim. I've got a chapter in the book about sexual violence and rape and child abuse. I don't tend to talk about that. That's a bit much for an evening, but it is in there, and I am very happy to answer questions about it. But then on a more positive note, so I finished the book with thinking about the role of sex in medieval culture. Particularly in literature and about art, because anybody who's read the Canterbury Tales, the Decameron, knows that there's a lot of bawdy tales in medieval literature. Lots of lecherous clerics and stupid husbands and sex-mad women. Also, more bizarrely, genitals as standalone characters who go around having adventures. That's quite a novel one to us. Some really ridiculous euphemisms. There's one that sticks in my mind where sex is described in terms of a squirrel looking for nuts. Yeah, you have to read them to believe them. A lot of it does feel really bizarre to us, but I think it's really interesting. And medieval art could also be really quite strange, just to show you a few examples of that to wrap up. So things like Sheila's, naked women exposing their genitals on medieval churches. To ask you, well, what would you put that on a church for? People had so much ink built on this one, and I don't think anybody's ever come up with a really convincing answer. Possibly that some people think they're to ward off evil. They might be to ward off evil. Possibly they've got sort of a pedagogical purpose. They're teaching you about the dangers of lust. What they clearly are, they're on churches and they're on big cathedrals and stuff as well. They're not some sort of pagan cult continuing, I don't think it's that. They are sanctioned by the church. And yet this is the drunkenness of Noah exposing his genitals again. I think that's above the choir stalls in Norwich Cathedral. What you'd do that for, who knows? And then, but other places too, so manuscripts. This is a particularly popular example. This is a French manuscript of the Romance of the Rose. No particular reason to put pictures of, nuns having sex and picking penises off trees on the corners of this manuscript, but they thought it was a good idea. Don't think I can explain that one either. And then there's more of the personal ephemera. Stuff like this seal, this chap's nickname is Foucault, which I think you can probably work out what that translates as. What's very hard about this is we've only got very few examples of is this one really odd chap who his friends all thought, what's the matter with him? Or was this the sort of thing that you had in your house that was quite normal? We don't know. Again, there are odd sort of examples of crockery with this sort of thing on. There's a house somewhere in Slovenia that has still got a fireplace tiled with all sorts of obscene images. Yeah, who knows what that was all about. And then these, people always like these badges of genitals. This goes back to this idea about genitals going around having adventures of their own, and these ones are off on pilgrimage, as they do. And some people think that they might be sort of good luck charms. So that one on the left, the legend on the bottom, penis go in. Is it a sort of, a good luck charm? But loads and loads of these have been found. They're made of cheap material. Loads of them have turned up. Some have been dragged out of rivers in this country. Most of them are from the Low Countries. But clearly they were very popular for bizarre reasons. So so I started off by saying that, they did have a lot in common with us, and they did have a lot in common with us. They did deal with a lot of the same problems. A lot of their ideas are not quite as mental as maybe they seem to start with. But yes, they did go around wearing badges of genitals going on pilgrimage, so who knows? I think I'll leave you with that image. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Just going to put that there so we have time. Thank you for that. I will note I am from the Low Countries, and I don't think I've ever been more proud. where I'm from. Yeah, this is a good day. Thank you so much. I'll come and sit with you. So we have time for some questions. There's already a question. I was going to say I might steal the floor, but there is already a question at the back. I don't know if our helpers might... If you maybe wave again. Yes, there's someone on the way. They're already very keen. Excellent. I'm sure you have lots to ask. No surprise.
I will confine myself to just one question, but I imagine most people in this room have many. Of all of the sort of homosexual stories you came across, for you, which one was like the most compelling? Which one did you enjoy the most for these sort of secret relationships where clearly, you know, they've sort of been together for a while and got caught or, you know, have put grave markers? Which one did you enjoy the most out of all the ones you found?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that is a particularly good one, the Italian one, where clearly you've got this relationship going on. There is a lot of evidence from Italy. There's a wonderful book about 16th century cases that is a bit too late for me, but about same-sex marriage in Renaissance Rome, which often people are quite surprised by. That's quite interesting. But yeah, I mean, some of the stories about women as well that I didn't have time to fit in this evening. There's a fantastic Italian case about a woman who she's talking to a chap about how she's attracted to this widow, and the chap basically asks her, well, how does that work? And she goes on to explain that she's got this set of sorts of dildo-type devices. That's a bizarre story, but she ends up getting exiled from the city for this. But one of the things I think is really interesting about it is it does seem to me to go back to this idea of this sort of active and passive roles, and that they do really try and force people into those roles, even when it doesn't necessarily seem obvious to us, if that makes sense.
Very black and white, then.
Yeah.
Wonderful. More questions? Oh, there are loads of questions. Is there one microphone, or do you have one? Yes, the lady in the purple top. I didn't quite spot who was first, but we'll see. There's loads. Wonderful.
I just wanted to ask whether you didn't really talk about distinctions in class, and if there was a difference of ideas. Sorry, it's not a very good, not a very well worded question, but did people in the upper classes have a similar idea to people in lower classes about sex? Were people in lower classes be able to be more free with their sexuality? Was it more contained in upper classes? Was there anything that you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the ideas, I think they are all shaped by these same religious and medical ideas, and by accepting the idea that society does up to a point need to control this. In terms of sort of, the differences between social class, I think it's really hard to pin down. I mean, you do get sort of, there might be a north-south divide going on as well, in that particularly in the sort of Italy and the sort of the Mediterranean regions, they are very keen on controlling their women and keeping them indoors, particularly the upper class women, which means they are very restricted, which means that poorer women probably have more options. Also means poorer women are far more likely to end up in court having been rape victims, so there are downsides to that. I mean, probably you have more freedom in terms of who you marry if you're a poor person and there isn't loads of money at stake. Having said that, you're probably more likely to be hauled up in front of the church courts if you're a peasant than if you're somebody important. They're probably more likely to deal with that discreetly. There are cases where, in terms of the church punishing people for different sexual offences, well, it's okay to, beat a peasant around the marketplace, but you have to give an important person a fine sort of, or something that, a fasting or something that they can do discreetly without anybody noticing. So there's, all sorts of various dynamics at play there.
Interesting. I think there was a question behind you as well. Is that right? Yes.
Hi. It's more to do with like the symbolic imagery that's seemed to be found, like the penises around like various paintings and statues. I was wondering to what extent humor played into that. Like commonly in current contemporary times, we tend to use like innuendos and stuff. I was wondering if that was something that also played a part into the culture of sex in the medieval history.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is hard to look at a lot of this sort of stuff and not think that clearly they did find it funny, and definitely a lot of the literature, it clearly is meant to be amusing. all these stories. And yeah, I mean, the pictures are harder to interpret because they don't spell it out for us. But I think there is this sense that, yeah, a lot of it is supposed to be amusing and a lot of it is ridiculous. I mean, there are sort of lots of really, some of the images I've got there are more sort of tame. Some of them are really bizarre. And some people have suggested that one of the things these images might be for is to help people sort of, the little mnemonics, so that you know that story you want is on the page with all the nuns having sex, and that will help you to find it in a sort of a vast manuscript that it might be appropriate. Still seems a weird thing to do to us. I don't think I shall start doodling on my books like that, but definitely not the library books. But yeah, I think there definitely is an element of humour, and that's what it's for. Yeah.
It's a really good question, because I think you also cite in your book some of the, you give little examples of the riddles. There's like various English riddles which are kind of sound really rude, but the answer is supposed to be very kind of innocent. So clearly people were having fun with, it's the sort of thing like, oh, I am an object and I wet the lady's eye if you rub me the wrong way or the right way, I don't know. The answer is onion, like you're not supposed to get your heads out of the gutter. That's kind of,
Yeah.
So clearly people were having fun, right, with that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I think there was some questions over here. Oh, we've got loads now. I think, yes, maybe this man on the front row, and then we'll go that way, we'll go that way.
Well, it's another sort of class-based question. Was there such a thing as droit de seigneur? Is that fact or fiction, or, as the phrase implies, purely a French thing?
Yeah, the droit de seigneur, this idea that the lord of the manor gets to sleep with the bride on her wedding night. It seems to be a complete fabrication. It crops up a lot in culture from about the 18th century onwards, and there doesn't seem to be anything firm about it before that. Bit like the chastity belt. It's really called our imagination. It doesn't seem to have figured in theirs. Yeah.
I think behind you was a question as well, I don't know. I keep wanting to stand up to yeah.
Yes, I mean, the Middle Ages, I think, lasted for several hundred years. I'm wondering whether there was any shift in attitudes towards sex during that period. In particular, I'm thinking an event like the Black Death, which killed about a third of the population, that must have had some impact on how people saw this and what was allowed, what was not allowed. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely there's quite a lot of change over time, from things like, the increasing obsession with marriage as a sacrament that means adultery shouldn't break a marriage, the sort of the panics about sodomy in certain places. In terms specifically of the Black Death, a lot of chroniclers writing after the Black Death complain that people basically go mad and there's lots of incest and people marry all sorts of unsuitable people and have sex outside of marriage, and it's all chaos. Interesting, you do get cases after. There's one particular case that sticks in my mind from, I think it's Hereford, of a couple who they do marry after the Black Death, and they later end up in court for incest. They're too closely related. I think it's godparents in that case is what connects them. I think he's the godfather of her son by her first husband. And they justify it in the terms of the fact there were so few people around in the Black Death. Well, they had to marry somebody, so they had to be allowed to marry people more closely related. And I think they do get a dispensation for it. I think there would have been limits to that. I don't think you could marry your brother and the church would have gone, well, it was the Black Death. But yeah, there was some leeway there, I think. It did have an impact.
Was there a question on that side? And then we'll go back, because there seemed to be... No? Has it been withdrawn? Sorry, then there's a question there.
You said that there were a lot of rules about how people should or should not have sex. How was that kind of thing delivered? Was it cultural, or was there like a formal curriculum in schools, or where there were schools, how people got sex education and sexual health education?
Yeah, I mean, the sexual education, it's quite difficult to find out. Some people have argued that wealthier schoolboys were getting some of their sexual education from classical texts and the like. I think there's a strong expectation in terms of women that your mother should prepare you for your marriage night, and that men probably will gain their knowledge by sleeping around. There are another sort of vein of these sort of literature stories. There's a whole load of them about men who are so ignorant that they get to their wedding night and they don't know what to do. Sometimes then the mother-in-law comes along and explains it to them in really quite graphic terms. You wonder whether that was really helpful. But yeah, I mean, the details on a more prosaic level. I mean, I think probably one of the things we have to bear in mind is, of course, people had a lot less privacy. You know, often people were living in one room, and so you would have probably shared a room with people who were having sex. Houses are quite flimsy. There are cases where, you know, people get caught for doing things they shouldn't because somebody sees it through a hole in the wall. Yeah, so I think it's pretty fair. They haven't got the sort of pervasive sort of media type culture that we've got around us now. But probably in terms of exposure to actual sex, probably they were getting more at second hand than we would hope to now.
Oh, there are more questions. Maybe we could try one more, and then I think for time we might have to, but maybe one more at the back. So, yes, right at totally at the back. Oh no. Well, she's getting her exercise in, and that's good. Oh God.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk, first of all. I find it really interesting. I've read in some other books about how, for example, some swear words that we currently have tend to revolve quite a lot around sex and around genitals. And I was wondering if language was something that you had looked into as part of the book, and whether or not you saw any differences, whether there was either more freedom or less freedom in the way that people spoke about sex in the medieval times.
Yeah, no, there is a little bit about this at the end of the book. I mean, I think in terms of, yeah, definitely the sort of the worst swear words, according to them, were mainly religious ones. You know, to swear on God's body parts of various kinds is probably the most offensive thing you can do, or yeah, anything to do with Jesus, the Virgin Mary. In terms of the language, what is actually really interesting is, yeah, that some of the words that we now consider to be seriously offensive, I'm going to start swearing in a minute, some of the words we now consider to be seriously offensive have either changed their meaning or seem to have been used quite differently then. So, fuck in the Middle Ages is largely used in the sense of to strike. So it turns up in place names, and it turns up in personal names. There's a chap living in Norwich at some point in the Middle Ages whose surname is Fuckbutter. And that's because he makes butter, and you make butter by slapping it around. Yeah, and that's not a one-off. There are other various examples, including, I think, one in Paris called Fuck the Goose, which we better not look at in too much detail. But yeah, I mean, also, they use, probably cunt now is probably one of the most offensive words you can say, isn't it? When they use it in the Middle Ages in the sense that we do now, but they seem to use it in much more prosaic ways. So there are, for example, Grope Cunt streets in various cities in England, which is the red light district. And it's a perfectly acceptable word to use in medical textbooks. Yeah, so that has changed really quite a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. I promise I wasn't trying to prompt you just to say swear words. I just find it really interesting. Thank you.
You fell for the trap.
Yeah.
Excellent. I think for the sake of time, we might have to leave it there, but I appreciate that there must be loads more questions once you get into this. There's so many fascinating examples. I think I should make a note before we go. Is that, yes, if you are interested in the book, it's right here. You can totally see it already here. You can peruse it, have a browse, and Katherine will be available to sign books, which I think would be a nice thing to take home with you if you were interested in that. Yes, then it leaves me to thank you, and I think for all of us to thank Katherine once more.